Star Trek the original series wasn't big on long-form storytelling. Episodes were mostly islands unto themselves, set in the same world, focused on the same characters, but telling self-contained stories that, once the episode was over, were never mentioned again. And that's how we liked it. However, this was not an absolute rule. There are a few wispy threads of plot that connect a handful of episodes together, as though a tiny spider delivered them from one installment to another, carried on a gentle breeze by a gossamer parachute. The easiest of these threads to see, and the one that wound up being the most important to Star Trek once it began to grow beyond the original series into the gymongous and ever-expanding franchise it is today, was started when we were introduced to these guys. The Klingons! How did Star Trek ever get along without them? Of course, they didn't look like this originally in the 60s. Their character design was a bit more basic, and sometimes, viewed from a certain perspective, a little problematic. But regardless of how they looked, the introduction of the Klingons was the start of one of Star Trek's earliest multi-episode story arcs. That being the case, I thought it might be fun and informative to spend a few minutes talking about who the original Klingons of classic Trek were and what they did. So, without further ado, let's... Kor. The first Klingon. The best Klingon, at least of the TOS class. That's right, I'm choosing favorites. They're fictional characters, not my kids. Although, if they were my kids, Kor would still be my favorite, because I would pick favorites among my kids, because I would be a lousy parent. So there. Kor, played by John Colicos, shows up in the episode Errand of Mercy from late in Star Trek's first season. He's the military governor of Organia, a strategically important planet recently occupied by the Klingons. War has just broken out between the Federation and the Klingon Empire. Kor and his troops reach Organia shortly after Kirk and Spock arrive to warn the people there about the imminent Klingon attack. When the Klingon fleet shows up, the Enterprise, commanded by Sulu under orders from Kirk to avoid a confrontation with a superior force, withdraws, leaving Kirk and Spock stuck on the planet surrounded by Klingons. At first, Kirk passes as an Organian because they all look human, but Spock is a dead giveaway as a Vulcan, which raises Kor's suspicions since Vulcans are members of the Federation. Kor orders Spock examined using the Klingons' mind sifter, suspecting that Spock is a spy. Spock's mental discipline is able to thwart the mind sifter, and he is released, his false identity as a merchant intact. But Kor discovers the truth about Kirk and Spock soon anyway. He has the Organian ruling council's chambers bugged, and hears Kirk taking credit for an act of sabotage he and Spock committed against the Klingons. Aelborn, the kinda-sorta leader of the Organians, gives away Kirk and Spock's true identities when Kor bursts in to arrest them. Kor had planned to execute Kirk and Spock, but once he learns that Kirk is the captain of a Starfleet ship, Kor invites him over for a drink first. Kor asks Kirk to tell him about the deployment of his fleet, but Kirk's like, nah, I'm really not supposed to talk about that with people we're at war with. Kor says, so I'm gonna have your Vulcan friend dissected to figure out how he was able to resist our mind sifter, and if I have to, I'll plug you into the mind sifter and rip the information I want out of your brain, which would leave you a vegetable, or you can just cooperate with me. Because the thing is, you and I aren't that different. These Organians are a bunch of sheep, but you and me, we're a couple of predators. And Kirk says, well, we're democratic and you all are a bunch of violent warmongers. But Kor waves that off as a minor ideological difference and sends Kirk to a dungeon cell so he can think over his offer, but he only gives Kirk 12 hours to make up his mind. Before the 12 hours are up, Aelborn shows up and lets Kirk and Spock out, assuring them that even though he turned them over to the Klingons, he doesn't want any violence to be done to them. Kor learns of their mysterious escape and gets on the public address system to tell the entire town, okay, here's the deal. Obviously, some of you Organians helped those 2 Federation prisoners escape. To show you we mean business, I've just had 200 Organians executed outside in the courtyard. If the prisoners haven't been returned in 2 hours, I'll kill 200 more, and I'll keep going until either the prisoners are turned over or all of you are dead. Have a pleasant afternoon. Kirk tries to inspire the Organians to resist the Klingons, but Eilborn and the other members of the Council don't seem to care about the 200 of their fellow citizens that have just been executed in the street. So Kirk's like, okay, screw it. I guess me and Spock will just go take on all of those Klingons by ourselves. Meanwhile, Kor is a little irritated by the apathy of the Organians too. He's sitting in his office like, am I really going to have to kill 200 more of these jerks? But before that can happen, Kirk and Spock show up with their phasers and capture Kor. He doesn't seem too worried, though. He informs Kirk that as they stand there, in space, a Federation fleet and a Klingon fleet are preparing to meet each other in a great battle that will, as Kor says, decide the destiny of the galaxy for the next 10,000 years. A group of Klingons bursts in to rescue Kor, but before anyone can shoot, everyone suddenly drops their phasers. At the same time aboard the Enterprise, everyone jumps out of their chairs. Apparently everything, phasers, control consoles, whatever, became too hot to touch. Eilborn walks in and casually explains that the Organians have disabled both fleets and made all weapons on both sides inoperable to put a stop to the war between the Federation and the Klingons. It turns out the Organians only appear to be corporeal for the benefit of visitors. They are actually beings of pure energy, possessing godlike powers. Eilborn tells Kirk and Kor that unless they agree to make peace immediately, the armed forces on both sides will be completely immobilized. Kirk and Kor take turns protesting, insisting that they each have legitimate grievances with the other, but Eilborn doesn't want to hear it. He says, you're trying to defend your right to wage war and kill countless people, and we're just not having it anymore. You might as well make peace now, because in the future, after millions of you have died, you're going to become friends anyway. Kor's like, yeah, right. Eilborn says, okay, you're really harsh on our buzz now, so get lost. Work out a peace treaty. And then the Organians transform into their true forms and vanish. Kirk turns to Kor and says, well, I guess that's it. The Organians aren't gonna let us fight. And Kor smiles and says, a shame, Captain. It would have been glorious. I love Kor. Even though they would change and evolve through the movies and TNG and everything that followed, Kor really laid the foundation for the Klingons as a group. He's militant and ruthless and full of personality. He's not my very favorite Klingon, but I see a lot of him in my very favorite Klingon, General Chang from Star Trek VI. I did a whole video about Chang a while back, and one of the things I love about him is how he feels like a bit of a throwback to classic Trek Klingons like Kor, erudite, charming, but unmistakably dangerous. The kind of fellow who would stab you in between heartbeats, and the last thing you'd see before the world went dark would be the twinkle in his eye. Or eyes, as the case may be. Not only did Kor himself provide the mold from which subsequent Klingons were formed, the story of Errand of Mercy established the plot framework in which every other classic Trek Klingon episode took place. The Trouble with Tribbles in Season 2 establishes the existence of the Organian Peace Treaty, an agreement that defines a neutral zone between Federation and Klingon territory and allows each side to take shore leave at the other's facilities located along the border. That treaty and its terms would be used to build tension between our heroes and their Klingon adversaries in subsequent episodes. And I'm going to talk about those, but before we even get to the Trouble with Tribbles, I need to acknowledge one of the forgotten Klingons of classic Trek. Kras. or as he is also known, Klingon. Played by Ty Gandrews, he appears in the episode Friday's Child earlier in Season 2, but his name is never actually established on screen. We call him Kras because that's his name in the script. I'd say, oh, the poor guy, but honestly, him being overlooked to the point of not even having an established name fits his gimmick, because the thing about Kras is he's kind of a loser. When Captain Kirk arrives at the planet Capella 4 to bargain with the inhabitants for the right to mine a valuable mineral, he finds that Kras is already there attempting to obtain mining rights for the Klingons. Kras supports a rebellion against the leader of the Capellans by tribal leader Mob, promising him Klingon support in exchange for the coveted minerals. Things seem to be going Kras's way for a while. Mob takes over as the new leader, while Captain Kirk, Spock, and Dr. McCoy are forced to flee into the wilderness with Eileen, the pregnant widow of the dead previous leader. Capellan custom demands that Mob kill Eileen and her child to consolidate his own power. Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and Eileen manage to evade the Capellans long enough for Eileen to give birth. When a group of Capellans, including Mob and Kras, catch up to them, Eileen runs out to meet them and tells Mob that the others, including her baby, are dead. Mob takes Eileen's word for it, but Kras demands to see the bodies to verify her story. This angers Mob. See, the Capellans are an honest people, and they take great offense whenever someone questions their integrity or violates their customs. They also really hate it when someone shows force against them, which makes Kras's next move, pulling a phaser and disintegrating one of Mob's men, then threatening to kill everybody, a really big no-no. Mob steps forward and offers himself up, defiantly crying out, "Klingon!" And Kras is like, "Seriously? How long have I been here? Do you even know my name?" And then Kras disintegrates him, and then Keel, Mob's lieutenant, kills Kras with a Kligot, a lethal and hilarious Capellan weapon that emits a cheeky whistle right before it ends you. While Kras himself isn't all that memorable or important, his participation in Friday's Child is significant for what it tells us about the state of things between the Federation and the Klingons post-Errand of Mercy. For the remainder of Star Trek The Original Series, the conflict will be defined by simmering tension, political maneuvering, and proxy fighting rather than open direct warfare. In other words, a Cold War. Kinda exactly like the one in which the United States and the Soviet Union were involved at the time these episodes were originally airing. We check in on the Federation Klingon Cold War later in Season 2 when we get to The Trouble with Tribbles, and we meet our next classic Klingon, Koloth. Played by William Campbell, Koloth shows up midway through The Trouble with Tribbles to add to the headaches being given to Captain Kirk by the so-called Sherman's Planet affair. The planet is located in disputed territory, with both the Federation and the Klingons making a claim, according to the Organian Peace Treaty, specifically mentioned here for the first time. Whichever side demonstrates it can develop the planet most efficiently will be granted control. To that end, the Federation has dispatched Mr. Barris, its Undersecretary of Agricultural Affairs, to nearby Space Station K7 with several tons of grain to be planted on Sherman's planet. Fearing the Klingons will attempt sabotage, Barris has invoked emergency regulations and drafted Kirk and the Enterprise to guard the grain. Kirk doesn't like this. He bridles at being ordered around by a bureaucrat like Barris. Plus, sure, the Sherman's Planet deal is important and all, but guarding storage compartments full of grain? That's not sexy. Does this episode even have a love interest? No, it does not. So you could understand why Kirk is a little grumpy. And then Koloth shows up, accompanied by Korax, who, like Kras, is named only in the script, and demands that his crew be granted shore leave aboard K7. Koloth reminds Kirk that under the terms of the Organian Peace Treaty, the Klingons cannot be refused shore leave, so Kirk reluctantly agrees, cautioning Koloth that there will be a heavy Starfleet security presence aboard the station to ensure there will be no trouble, which works out just fine. As far as his character goes, Koloth has some of the same charm as Kor. He's charming, superficially friendly. It's obvious that there's treachery hiding behind his smile, but he lacks Kor's ruthlessness. In Errand of Mercy, Kor gets his point across by ordering mass executions and threatening to have Spock dissected. In The Trouble with Tribbles, Koloth shows his displeasure with Kirk's conduct by demanding a formal apology and warning that there could be a diplomatic incident. "You've been most uncourteous, Captain Kirk," he complains at one point, reminding us all of that oft-spoke Klingon phrase, "Today is a good day to treat others with respect." Not the most threatening soldier of the Empire we've ever seen, is he? Then again, some of that is probably due to the circumstances. As Koloth himself reminds Kirk in their first scene, there has been no declaration of hostilities between the Federation and the Klingons. They are officially at peace, and both sides seem determined to carry out their interactions within the limits defined by the treaty. That means verbal exchanges dripping with sarcasm, a little bit of spy shit. Arn Darvin, assistant to Mr. Barris, turns out to be a Klingon agent trying to poison the grain. You know the story. And attempts to bait the other side into starting a fight, which Korax manages to do successfully by trashing the Enterprise right to Scotty's drunken face. Unlike Kor, against whom Kirk tries to lead an armed revolt, and Kras, whom Kirk clearly wants to kill with a bow and arrow, there's never any serious animosity between Kirk and Koloth. It's obvious they don't like each other or trust each other, but you don't get the feeling that they're on some kind of violent collision course. The episode ends with Kirk proving that Darvin is a Klingon spy and telling Koloth to get lost, and Koloth gets lost. Doesn't even get a parting threat. "This isn't over, Kirk." Nothing. He just really wanted to get away from those shrieking tribbles, I guess. I can relate. I feel the same way whenever I'm at a restaurant and there's a screaming child like 2 tables over. I just want to get my food to go and escape. I'm sitting there all pissed off like I should not have to put up with this. This is not a Chuck E. Cheese. This is a Burger King. The Cold War between the Federation and the Klingons did not consist only of trying to screw each other out of mining rights and competing to see who could grow the most grain on disputed planets. There was also some killing going on, just not directly, which brings us another of the forgotten Klingons of classic Trek, Krell. Remember him? No? That's okay, I'll remind you. Krell, played by Ned Romero, appears in the second season episode A Private Little War, which originally aired a little over a month after The Trouble with Tribbles. Like Kras, Krell's name is never established on screen, and we know it only because he is named in the script. This is the episode where Kirk and McCoy find themselves embroiled in a conflict between 2 factions on a planet where civilization hasn't progressed beyond the Stone Age. The Klingons have provided one side with flintlock muskets, a very advanced weapon for people at this stage of development. Eventually, Kirk decides the only thing to do is provide the same type of arms to the opposing side in the conflict to maintain a balance of power and keep the Klingons from gaining control of the planet through the faction they're supporting. This is one of my favorite episodes to bring up whenever someone complains about modern Star Trek being too obvious and pushy about its politics. There's a scene in this episode where Kirk says to McCoy, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this is essentially what he says, "The situation we're in now sure is a lot like the Vietnam War, huh?" He doesn't say Vietnam, he says brush wars, but he mentions 2 global powers, much like the Klingons and the Federation, engaging in a proxy war from which neither side felt they could withdraw. You can connect the dots however you want, but the dude was talking about Vietnam on TV in 1968. I love that subtle classic Trek political messaging, don't you? There's not much to say about Krell. He's in exactly one scene, has a handful of lines, all expository. He's really only there to establish that the Klingons are responsible for arming one side in this local war with superior weapons. He's a plot device more than a character, which is too bad because if you asked Trekkies to draw a classic Trek-era Klingon from memory, I bet most of us would come up with something that looks like Krell. Thick, dark, swept-back hair, bushy eyebrows, facial hair of a coffee shop poet, and an artificially darkened complexion that makes you bite your lip and say, "Is that okay?" I'm not sure that's okay. Next classic Trek Klingon, Kang. Played, no, not that one, wrong Kang. Although, now that I've put that out into the universe, tell me casting Jonathan Majors as Kang the Klingon in a Star Trek movie wouldn't be a license to print money. Although, I guess he might feel a little funny about playing two Kangs. Wouldn't want to get typecast. I don't blame him. So let him play whoever he wants. Just put Jonathan Majors in a Star Trek movie. In fact, just put Jonathan Majors in any movie. When does Creed 3 come out? March 3rd. Set reminder. I like Jonathan Majors, but... Right! Kang! Klingon Kang, played by Michael Ansara, appears in Season 3's Day of the Dove, and Jesus Christ, is that okay? This is Michael Ansara's natural complexion. I'm not sure that's okay. Kirk, McCoy, Chekhov, and a red shirt beam down to a planet in response to a distress call from a Federation colony which said it was being attacked by an unidentified ship. Chekhov's scan shows that the entire colony and everyone who lived there is gone, but he can find no evidence of an attack. It's as if the colony just vanished. Spock calls from the Enterprise to report that a Klingon ship has entered the area. Kirk immediately assumes the Klingons are somehow responsible for the attack on the colony, but when a party of Klingons beams down, they report their own troubles. Kang, the Klingon commander, announces that his ship is disabled and most of his crew is dead. He claims the Enterprise as his own and declares Kirk and the others to be prisoners of the Klingon Empire. While Kirk and Kang argue, they both received distress calls to bring them here, and each blames the other for the destruction inflicted on their side, a mysterious light floats nearby. When Kirk calls Spock and orders everyone beamed aboard the Enterprise, the light follows them up. Kirk and his landing party are materialized first, and with help from a couple of extra red shirts, they disarm the Klingons when they're beamed in. Kirk also orders the few remaining survivors from Kang's ship beamed aboard and has the Klingons taken to the crew lounge. It turns out Chekhov has something of a bitter history with the Klingons. His brother was killed during an earlier Klingon raid on a Federation outpost. As a result, he's completely convinced that the Klingons are responsible for destroying this planet's colony and for several other recent attacks. Kirk points out that there's no evidence linking the Klingons to any of those incidents, but McCoy chimes in, telling Kirk, "What proof do we need? We know what a Klingon is." Good to know white guys from Georgia won't change much in the next 200 years. Once the Klingon ship has been fully evacuated, Kirk orders it destroyed with the Enterprise's phasers. Communications with Starfleet are down, though Uhura can't figure out why. Then, the Enterprise suddenly changes course and jumps to Warp 9. What's more, emergency bulkheads have inexplicably been closed all over the ship, trapping most of the crew. And to top it all off, Sulu reports that their new course will take the ship out of the galaxy. Still figuring the Klingons are somehow responsible, Kirk heads down to the crew lounge where they're being held. Kang protests his innocence, pointing out that he and all of his surviving crew have been here the entire time. Kirk's like, "Whatever, I'm gonna punch that grease paint right off your face." A fight ensues between the Starfleet group and the Klingons, but with a wacky Star Trek twist. Their phasers, along with other objects in the room, like a chess set and a plant, instantly transform into swords. The Klingons fight their way out of the lounge, and Kirk retreats to the bridge. Kirk has ordered Scotty to get to work trying to free the crew trapped by the emergency bulkheads, so he tells Sulu to go down and take command of engineering. But Chekhov wants to go too. He jumps up with a sword, swears to avenge the death of his brother, and runs onto the turbolift. Sulu's like, "What's with him?" Kirk says he's still sore because his brother was killed by Klingons a while back. And Sulu says, "But, Captain, Chekhov is an only child. He doesn't have a brother." Well, I guess you would know. Absolutely, I would. Wait, what's that mean? Just that you and Chekhov are... That is, I assumed you two were... best friends? That's it, exactly. Best friends. Now, get down to engineering. Best friends. That's what I was going to say. Uh-huh. Why would Chekhov think he has a brother if he hasn't got one? Do I know? While Kang and his group plot to take over the ship, Scotty reports that they're unable to cut through the emergency bulkheads to free the rest of the Enterprise crew. Somehow the metal has changed, and it's now impossible for the phaser torches to cut through. Also, all the weapons have been transformed into swords. Kirk tells Scotty to get back to engineering. Spock informs Kirk that the free Enterprise crew members and the Klingons are equal in number, 30 on each side. The Klingons have taken control of Deck 6 and part of Deck 7, while the Enterprise crew still controls the decks above. Kang's force captures engineering. At the same time on the bridge, Spock detects the presence of the alien light being, which is hanging around in engineering. Computer analysis shows that the alien is intelligent and made of pure energy. Kirk and Spock deduce that the light being must be somehow responsible for all the recent events, the disappearance of the Federation colony, the distress calls that drew the Enterprise and the Klingons together, the changing of their weapons to swords, Chekhov's sudden lust for vengeance for his non-existent brother. Kirk and Spock agree that the best way to handle things going forward is to try and make peace with Kang. But McCoy, whose innate racism has apparently been turbocharged by whatever's going on, doesn't like that. He says they should wipe the Klingons out, and then indignantly returns to sickbay. Kang turns off life support to the rest of the ship. Scotty returns to the bridge, and he's like, "Chekhov's right, we should have left those Klingon bastards in the transporter. Now they'll learn everything about our technology and use it to destroy the Federation, and it's all your fault, you soft, liberal piece of shit!" Spock tells Scotty to settle down, and Scotty's like, "Don't touch me, you green-blooded half-breed!" And Spock responds to Scotty by saying that he has not entirely enjoyed the time he has spent around humans, because even in the future, there just aren't any truly hurtful racial slurs referring to white people. Kirk separates them, tries to get them to see what's going on. They're at each other's throats for no reason. Something is compelling them to think in terms of war and violence and race hatred. Spock agrees, observing that circumstances seem to have been manipulated to magnify hostilities between humans and Klingons. But why? And by who or what? Life support comes back on. Kang tries to shut it off again, but nothing doing. The Enterprise's systems are being controlled by something else. Spock localizes the alien light being near engineering, so Kirk and Spock take off to find it. On the way, they run into Chekhov, who has killed one of the Klingons, and looks like he's about to do something very bad to Mara, Kang's wife. Kirk grabs Chekhov and smacks him around a little. Then Kirk and Spock take Chekhov and Mara to sickbay, where McCoy seems to have suppressed his raging bigotry back down to its normal level. He apologizes for his earlier behavior and tells Kirk that so far, despite multiple violent encounters between the Enterprise crew and the Klingons, no one has died. In fact, their wounds are all healing at an accelerated rate. Apparently, the being responsible for this conflict wants everyone alive. Kirk, Spock, and Mara head to engineering, but along the way, Johnson, the red shirt from the landing party at the beginning, shows up, and he's... Hold on. The red shirt's name is Johnson? A security officer named Johnson. On the Enterprise. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever... Never mind. Move along. Let's go. Johnson if that is his real name, wants to kill him some Klingons, but Kirk steps in to stop him. They cross swords. The light being is nearby, glowing red. Spock gives Johnson the neck pinch, and the light being shifts to yellow. Spock notices this. He's like, fascinating. When Lieutenant Johnson was filled with hatred and anger, he's a lieutenant? Whatever. Anyway, Spock figures out that the strange alien light being seems to feed on hostile emotions. That would explain why its trapped equal opposing forces on the ship is compelling them to fight, providing them with weapons, and healing their injuries so they can keep fighting. Their only hope is to make peace with the Klingons, starve the alien of the anger and hatred that sustains it. Oh, and they've only got 12 minutes to do that before the ship's dilithium crystals deteriorate and they lose all engine power and are stuck drifting in space and fighting each other forever. So Kirk thinks, I know how to calm Kang down. And he calls Kang in engineering and says, hey, we have your wife, and if you don't agree to an immediate truce, we're gonna kill her. Kang says, go ahead and kill her. We're Klingons. You think we give a shit? Kirk's like, damn, I can't believe me threatening to murder his wife didn't convince him to be my friend. But Kirk's gamble has paid off in a different way. Mara says, hey, you told Kang you were going to kill me, but then you didn't. I respect that. I'm going to talk to him for you. So, with time running out, Kirk and Mara beam into engineering. Kang is surprised to see Mara still alive, but he's still in more of a slashin' mood than a talkin' mood. While they clash swords, Kirk tries to explain to Kang what's happening, how they've been manipulated into this conflict, how no one has died and no one will die because the point is for both sides to keep fighting. Finally, Kang sees the light. Literally, he notices the light that's been causing all this. And Kirk says, do you want to be a pawn to that thing forever? And Kang's like, no. If I kill you, it'll be because I want to, not because some overgrown Tinkerbell wants me to. Kirk gets on the shipwide intercom and orders all fighting to stop. He declares a truce with the Klingons. Kang does the same to his troops. All over the ship, the fighting stops. The light changes color. It doesn't like that. Kirk says to the light, you might as well get lost, because we're not going to fight each other for you anymore. Kang agrees. Sort of. He says, yeah, we still hate their guts, but we're going to be nice to each other for right now, so scramoose! And the Enterprise crew and the Klingons laugh and laugh and laugh, and Kang slaps Kirk really hard on the back, and you can tell he did it on purpose, and Kirk looks like he's about to belt him, but then he remembers, oh, right, escaping our ultimate doom, and goes back to laughing, and the light being turns white, and is like, okay, this is weird, I'm gonna bounce. Later, weirdos. Of all the classic Trek Klingons, Kang feels the most like a Klingon from the later era. He lives for battle, he clearly views victory to be more important than any one person's life, even his own wife's, and he possesses a sense of honor. He insists that the Klingons have abided by the peace treaty with the Federation, and the thing that finally convinces him to agree to a truce with Kirk is the suggestion that otherwise his actions would not be his own. He'll be a soldier of the Empire, but he won't be a pawn. Kang's a fighter, but he realizes that fighting for its own sake is a fool's pastime. He'll do battle for honor, for the Empire, for glory, but not when there's no hope for victory. That attitude would become one of the defining traits of Klingon culture by the time Star Trek The Next Generation came around. Taken as a whole, the Klingon episodes of Star Trek the original series and the Klingon characters we meet in them tell a story that is not only complete and satisfying on its own, but that leaves behind a roadmap for future stories to follow. We see the Federation and the Klingons as enemies engaging in open warfare and errand of mercy. Then we check in on them a few times as they maintain an uneasy peace, competing for resources, fighting through proxies instead of direct combat. Finally, in Day of the Dove, our heroes and their Klingon enemies find themselves in a situation where their survival depends on rejecting endless war and finding a way to actually coexist. Just as the Organian Aelborn predicts in Errand of Mercy, the end of Day of the Dove sees Kirk's Starfleet crew and the Klingons become fast friends, albeit temporarily and under duress. There's another connection between Errand of Mercy and Day of the Dove that I find gratifying. The premises of the two episodes are, roughly speaking, inversions of each other. In Errand of Mercy, Kirk and Kor and their respective forces are determined to fight each other, and they are forced into peace through the intervention of superior alien beings. In Day of the Dove, Kirk and Kang and their respective forces are manipulated into hostilities by a superior alien being, and they're at the mercy of that being until they determine to stop fighting each other. There was almost another even stronger thread connecting Errand of Mercy and Day of the Dove. Originally, Kor was supposed to appear in both episodes, which would have made them neat bookends for the classic Trek Klingon saga, but John Colicos was shooting a film in Europe at the time and was unavailable, so we got Kang instead. I think it worked out well enough, though. Technically, there are two more Klingon appearances in classic Trek after Day of the Dove. In Elan of Troyes, which originally aired about halfway through the show's third and final season, the Enterprise is menaced by a Klingon ship. The Klingon commander appears on the view screen a few times, but we never learn his name, and his lines consist entirely of threats and demanding that Kirk surrender. So, there you go, Kras, Krell. You two aren't the most forgettable classic Trek Klingons after all. Then, in the show's third-to-last episode, The Savage Curtain, or as I like to think of it, Captain Kirk meets Space Lincoln, we see a recreation of Kahless made by a rock monster who wants to learn about good and evil. And while Alien Rock Monster creates replicas of human and alien historical figures and forces them to fight so it can learn about good and evil is probably the most Star Trek premise ever, Kahless himself doesn't leave much of an impression. Other than, of course, his impressions. Spock! Help me, Spock! With all due respect to Kras and Krell and the rest, when it comes to Klingons of classic Trek, there are only three that really matter: Kor, Koloth, and Kang. All three would return in not one, but two subsequent Star Trek shows. Kor and Koloth appear in episodes of Star Trek the Animated Series, where both are voiced by James Doohan, and Kang appears in Flashback, the Captain Sulu episode from Star Trek Voyager's third season. And, of course, they all appear in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, most memorably in Season 2's Blood Oath, where the three classic Trek Klingons team up, along with Jadzia Dax, to seek revenge on the killer of their sons. Kor returns for two more DS9 episodes after that, Season 4's The Sword of Kahless, one of my personal favorites, and Season 7's Once More Unto the Breach. But if I'm being honest, as much as I like some of those episodes, and as neat as it was to see Colicos, Campbell, and Ansara revisit their characters so many years later, that's all bonus content. The best Kor, Koloth, and Kang shows are their classic Trek episodes. Not only do they establish the Klingons as effective villains dramatically, comedically, and allegorically, they also show that, predominantly episodic though it was, the show was capable of long-form storytelling. In fact, I would argue that, historically, on TV and the big screen, Star Trek has been at its best when it has balanced strong, standalone episodes with ongoing storylines. And if you think I'm wrong about that, don't tell it to me. Take it up with them. But if you do, a word of advice, don't make fun of their sweaters. They were Koloth's idea. Of course they were Koloth's idea.